She called me a monster. He simply looked. The chains had cut into my wrists. For years, on my own planet, I had only read about humans in textbooks. Emotional, unpredictable, dangerous creatures. But right now, the dangerous one wasn't them. It was me, at least. That's what the men behind the glass believed. "Is specimen 7 ready?" Someone barked from behind the observation wall. I didn't move. I had learned that much in 3 weeks of captivity. Stillness was armor. Every time I flinched, they wrote something down. Every time I made a sound, they turned up the lights and left me in them for hours. So I sat on the cold concrete floor, my silver lavender wrists bleeding quietly, and I stared at the wall. They had found me 6 months after I landed. I had been careful. I had studied human behavior for 2 years before the mission, memorizing the way they walked, the way their eyes moved when they lied, the subtle architecture of their smiles. My skin was close enough, a shade between silver and pale ivory that I could explain away with a rare condition, a genetic anomaly, something that made strangers look twice and then look away out of politeness. My hair was long and white, the color of moonlight on snow. My eyes were violet deep, almost black at the center. These were harder to hide. I wore colored lenses. I kept my hair in a braid tucked beneath a hood. For 6 months, I had been invisible. Then one night, I made a mistake. A child had fallen into the river near the bridge on the east side of the city. I heard the splash before any human did. I heard her heartbeat slow. And before my training could override my instinct, I was already in the water, pulling her out, my lenses lost somewhere in the current, my hair loose and soaking, my eyes blazing violet in the dark. There were cameras. There are always cameras. They came for me 3 days later. Men in black uniforms with no insignia, driving vehicles with no plates. They were efficient and silent, and they knew exactly what I was before they even opened the van door. Someone had been watching for a long time. The facility was underground. I never saw daylight again after that night. 3 weeks into my captivity, they decided I wasn't cooperating fast enough. I understood their language perfectly. I had studied it for years, but I had made the strategic decision to pretend otherwise. It gave me an advantage. When they spoke freely around me, thinking I couldn't comprehend, I gathered information. I learned the layout of the facility. I learned the shift rotations. I learned that there were 7 other holding cells on my level, though I could never hear or smell another living being in any of them. I learned that in 4 days, they were going to move me to a different section of the building. The man who ran the facility was called Director Harlan. He was in his 60s, lean and gray-haired, with the practiced calm of someone who had made peace with every terrible decision he had ever made. He visited my cell every morning at precisely 7:14. He would stand on the other side of the reinforced glass, hands clasped behind his back, and study me the way a collector studies a rare and fragile thing he has no intention of releasing. "She's more stable today," he told someone on the 4th morning. "Lower the temperature in the cell tonight. Let's see how she responds to thermal stress." I sat very still and did not let my expression change. That night, when the temperature dropped to something that would have hospitalized a human, I curled on my side on the concrete floor and breathed slowly and thought about home. I thought about the amber light at dusk over the mountains. I thought about my sister's laugh, which sounded like water over smooth stone. I thought about the mission briefing, the careful voice of my commander telling me that Earth was not yet ready for contact, that I was only there to observe, to document, to return. I had failed every part of that mission, but I was still alive, and as long as I was alive, I had not failed completely. On the 22nd day, they brought him in. I heard the change in routine before I saw it: different footsteps in the corridor, heavier and more deliberate than the usual guards, a rhythm that spoke of someone who moved through the world like he owned the ground beneath his feet. Then the door to my observation room opened, and 2 guards entered, and behind them came a man I had not seen before. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of face that seemed carved rather than grown, sharp jaw, straight nose, a small scar cutting through his left eyebrow that somehow made the symmetry of his features more interesting rather than less. He wore a military uniform with no rank insignia visible, which told me he was either very low or very high. The way the guard stood slightly differently when he entered told me it was the latter. He looked at me. Most people who looked at me in this place did so with one of three expressions: clinical detachment, poorly concealed fear, or a specific kind of excited greed that made my skin crawl. This man looked at me with none of those things. He looked at me the way you look at something that surprises you, not frightened, not hungry, just recalibrating. His eyes were dark gray, almost the color of a storm about to break. "This is her," he said. "Specimen 7, said one of the guards. "Recovered from the East Bridge incident. Non-hostile so far, but uncooperative." "Non-hostile," he repeated. Not a question, more like he was testing the word in his mouth. He walked to the glass and stood there, hands in his pockets, and looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. I had nothing to lose by looking back. "How long has she been in the chains?" he asked. "Since day 4. She broke the first restraint system." Something moved across his face. It was brief and quickly controlled, but I had spent 2 years studying human microexpressions, and I caught it a flash of something that wasn't clinical, wasn't strategic. Something older than protocol, discomfort. "What's her name?" he asked. "We don't, her name." A pause. "We haven't established communication." He said nothing for a moment. Then he looked directly at me. Not at the glass, not at the space where I sat, but at me, with the specific focus of someone who understood that there was a difference. "I'm Captain Kael Doran," he said, speaking slowly and clearly, as if he genuinely believed I might understand him. "I'm not here to run tests on you. I've been asked to evaluate your situation and make a recommendation." I held his gaze. I said nothing. "I know that probably means nothing to you right now," he said, "but I want you to know it anyway." Behind him, one of the guards shifted impatiently. Kael didn't look at them. He stayed at the glass for another moment. Then he turned and walked out. I sat in the silence he left behind and felt something I had not felt in 22 days. Something that felt dangerously like hope. He came back. They never do. He returned the next morning. Not at 7, 14, when Director Harlan made his ritual appearance. Earlier, just past 6, when the facility was still running on skeleton staff, and the corridors had that particular kind of quiet that felt less like peace and more like held breath. I heard his footsteps before the door opened. I had already memorized the specific weight and rhythm of the way he walked. I told myself it was survival instinct. I told myself I cataloged everyone's movements this way. I was not entirely honest with myself. He came alone this time. No guards flanking him, no clipboard-carrying technician trailing behind. Just him, in the same military jacket as the day before, a paper cup of coffee in his hand that he clearly hadn't touched because it was still steaming. He stopped in front of the glass and looked at me, and I looked back, and for a moment neither of us did anything else. Then he sat down on the floor, not in a chair, not leaning against the wall with the casual authority of someone who owned this room. He sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor, on his side of the glass, as if that somehow made us closer to the same level. I stared at him. He looked at my wrists, at the chains, at the dried blood that the night staff hadn't bothered to clean, and his jaw tightened once briefly, and then he looked away and took a slow breath. "I read your file last night," he said. "What they've put together anyway." He paused. "You saved a child, that's how they found you. I did not move." "I keep thinking about that," he said. "You could have let her drown. You would have stayed hidden, but you didn't." He looked at me again. "That tells me something about you." The facility's ventilation system hummed overhead. Somewhere distant, a door opened and closed. "My recommendation goes to Director Harlan in 48 hours, Kael said. "After that, the decision about what happens to you moves up the chain, out of my hands." He was quiet for a moment. "I need you to understand what I'm telling you." I understood perfectly. In 48 hours, whatever thin margin of negotiation existed in my situation would close entirely. Whatever came after would be decided by people who had never sat on a cold floor and tried to speak to me like I was worth speaking to. I looked at him for a long time. Then I said, quietly in perfect English, "My name is Lyra." The expression that crossed his face in that moment, the way his eyes changed, the small, involuntary exhale, the stillness that fell over him like something had just shifted fundamentally in his understanding of the world. I memorized it completely. I wanted to keep it. In whatever came next, I wanted to have that moment somewhere safe inside me. "Lyra," he repeated, carefully, like it mattered how he said it. "I have been able to understand you since the first day," I said. My English was precise and unaccented, which I could see startled him further. I chose not to reveal that. "Smart," he said, no judgment in it, almost like approval. "They plan to move me in 2 days," I said. "I have heard them discussing it, the new section." I paused. "I do not think I will come back from the new section." Something hardened in his face. "No," he said, "you probably wouldn't. Then we are both aware of my situation." He looked at me for a long moment. The coffee in his hand had gone cold and forgotten. "What do you need?" he asked. "Right now, what do you need?" It was such a simple question, such a human question. What do you need? As if the answer were something he could actually provide. "To not be in chains," I said. He stood up. It took him 4 hours. I didn't know what he said to whom, or what authority he invoked, or what he promised in exchange. I only know that at 11 o'clock in the morning, 2 guards entered my cell with a key, and the chains came off my wrists, and I sat on the floor of my cell and pressed my freed hands flat against the cold concrete and breathed. Kael came back at noon. He had a medical kit. He sat on the other side of the glass, still on the floor, I noticed, still at my level, and watched while a medic came in and cleaned and bandaged my wrists. I watched Kael watching me, and I noticed the way his hands rested loose and open on his knees, deliberately unthreatening. I noticed the way he didn't look away when our eyes met. "Thank you," I said, when the medic had gone. "Don't thank me yet," he said quietly. "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I'm about to ask you something and you're not going to like it." I waited. "I can get you out of here," he said. "But I need to know, is there anyone else? Anyone else like you that they might go after? Anyone you could lead them to by leaving?" I studied his face carefully. He wasn't asking because he wanted to find them. He was asking because he wanted to make sure I wasn't walking out one door and opening another. "No," I said. "I am alone here. My mission was solo. No one knows where I am." Something in his shoulders released slightly. "Okay," he said. "You would do this," I said slowly. "You would risk your position, your career, possibly more." I watched him. "Why?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then, "Because you jumped into a freezing river to save a child who wasn't yours, on a planet that wasn't yours, knowing it might cost you everything." He paused. "And because you've been sitting in chains on a concrete floor for 3 weeks, and you still look at me like you're deciding whether I'm worth trusting." A quiet exhale. I want to be worth trusting. I felt something move through my chest, something warm and dangerous and entirely inconvenient. "The transfer is tomorrow morning," he said, "which means tonight is our only window." He looked directly at me. "Can you run?" I looked down at my bandaged wrists, at my hands, which had been still and restrained for so long that the simple act of spreading my fingers felt like defiance. "Yes," I said. "Then rest," he said. "I'll come back at midnight." He stood, and for just a moment he pressed one hand flat against the glass. Not a wave, not a gesture with any name I knew in any language. Just contact, just presence. I pressed my hand against the glass on my side. Neither of us said anything. Midnight. He kept his promise. I did not sleep. I lay on the narrow cot in my cell and stared at the ceiling and counted the minutes the way I had once counted stars, methodically, without attachment, simply to have something to hold on to. The facility settled into its nighttime rhythms around me. Shift change at 10. The distant sound of a television somewhere in the staff quarters. Footsteps that came and went until they didn't anymore. Silence. Then, at midnight exactly, footsteps I recognized. The door to my cell opened without the usual alarm sequence. He had disabled it somehow, or had the codes, or both, and Kael stepped inside wearing civilian clothes for the first time. Dark jacket, dark pants, nothing that would identify him as military to a casual observer. He had a bag over one shoulder. He looked at me and I looked at him, and we didn't waste time on words. "There are 2 guards at the east stairwell," he said quietly, moving to me. "We go west, Service corridor, loading bay, then out through the maintenance exit. I have a vehicle 2 blocks north. He met my eyes. There will be cameras. I know. Once we're out, there's no coming back from this for me. I know, I said again. Kael. I waited until he looked at me fully. I know what you are giving up. Something moved through his expression, complex and layered. The kind of thing that would have taken me years to understand in another person, but which I found I could read in him with a clarity that surprised me. He was afraid. Not of what was ahead, but of something quieter, something he wasn't saying. Let's go, he said. We moved through the facility like shadows. Kael knew the layout better than I expected, better than someone who had only been here 2 days should have. Later, I would learn that he had spent the previous night memorizing every camera angle, every guard rotation, every door that required a code versus a key. He had done this not because he had been planning to help me before he arrived, but because once he decided to, he committed completely. That was, I would come to understand, simply who he was. The service corridor was cold and smelled of metal and cleaning chemicals. Our footsteps were careful and quiet on the concrete floor. Kael moved ahead of me, checking each corner before we rounded it, his hand coming back to signal all clear in gestures that were economical and practiced. Military habit. I followed his lead without question, which I think surprised him. He glanced back at me once, as if checking that I was still there, and something shifted in his face when he saw how steadily I was moving. We reached the loading bay, and that was where things stopped going smoothly. There was a guard who wasn't supposed to be there. A young man, barely older than a student, sitting on a crate with a phone in his hand. He looked up at exactly the wrong moment, and for one frozen second the three of us existed in a triangle of mutual shock. Kael moved first. It was fast and precise, and the guard was unconscious on the floor in under 4 seconds, lowered carefully so he didn't hit his head. Kael zip-tied his wrists with something from his jacket pocket. He had come prepared for this too, and looked up at me. 30 seconds before the next camera sweep, he said. Move. We ran. The maintenance exit was a heavy metal door with a push bar, and it opened into a narrow alley between 2 buildings, and the night air hit me like something sacred. I stopped for just 1 second, one single second, and tilted my face up toward the sky. I could see stars through the gap between the buildings. Not my stars, but stars. Lyra, Kael's voice low and urgent. I know, I said. I'm here. We ran 2 blocks north through streets that were empty and wet from recent rain, our footsteps loud in the silence, the city dreaming around us. The vehicle was where he said it would be, an unremarkable dark car parked on a side street, keys already inside. We got in and he drove without turning on the headlights until we were 3 streets away. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The city slid past the windows, all its golden lights blurring in the rain-wet glass. I sat with my bandaged hands folded in my lap and watched the world move and felt something I hadn't felt in so long that it took me a moment to name it. Safe, not entirely, not permanently, but in this car in this moment with this man driving steadily through the dark, safe. Where are we going? I finally asked. North, he said. I have a place, remote. Off any grid they'll think to check first. He glanced at me briefly, then back at the road. It'll give us time to figure out the next step. Us, he had said it so naturally, as if that were simply the shape of things now. Kael, I said quietly. Yeah. On my planet, I said, when someone saves your life, there is a word for what they become to you. I paused. It doesn't translate well into English. He was quiet for a moment. What does it mean? I looked at him, at the clean line of his profile, the way his hands rested on the wheel, the small scar through his left eyebrow catching the orange of a passing streetlight. I thought about a man who sat on a cold floor to be at my level, who got the chains removed before he asked me for anything, who pressed his... What does it mean? I looked at him, at the clean line of his profile, the way his hands rested on the wheel, the small scar through his left eyebrow catching the orange of a passing streetlight. I thought about a man who sat on a cold floor to be at my level, who got the chains removed before he asked me for anything, who pressed his hand against glass in the dark and didn't need a name for what that meant. It means, I said slowly, that you are no longer a stranger to me, that whatever comes next, I face it knowing your name. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something better than a smile, something real. "Lyra," he said. "Yes, I don't know what comes next either." He exhaled slowly. "But I know your name now too." Outside, the city finally gave way to open road. Darkness ahead of us, stars above us, and somewhere north, a place to breathe. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. For the first time in 22 days, I let myself rest.